Hi, I'm Susan Downs, and my co-host here is Stephen Fawkes. And we're the Silicon Valley Health Institute. We are a nonprofit organization that have been bringing leading health experts to give information to the community. And we've been doing that for about 20 years. On our website, www.sv, as in Victor, HI, we put all these videos so the consumer can look at them. So today we're very honored to have Jeffrey Smith. He's one of the forerunners that introduced us to there might be an issue with GMO. He started investigating this long before the average person even knew there was an issue or even knew that these things were there. So he's a real pioneer and hero in my eyes. And he is a leading consumer advocate promoting healthier, non-GMO choices. He's written books on genetically engineered foods. First is called Seeds of Deception, exposing industry and government lies about the safety of genetically engineered foods you're eating. The second is called Genetic Roulette, the gamble of our lives. He's made a film in 2002, and his latest film, Secret Ingredients, is an important documentary highlighting the health effects of switching to an organic diet and eliminating GMO foods and glyphosate. He looks at several people, many people who had various ailments, and by switching to a healthier diet, they all got well. So he's going to share his wealth of information. This is important, and we need to get the word out to all the doubters and minimizers. And welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you so much, Susan, and welcome everyone. Uh, first of all, let me say this. I understand that many of you have a lot of background of this in this, and some of you don't. But I do welcome lots and lots of questions. And in a few minutes, after I give the introduction to what I'm talking about, I welcome an interactive session. So I'm speaking with you. I've spoken so many times all over the world in 45 countries. It's so rare to get a chance to have a more interactive um, presentation with many questions. So I'm going to favor that. But let me set the tone here by giving a summary of conclusions that I hope to support through the next hour or two. First of all, the conclusion regarding health is that eating organic is probably the most important or one of the most important things you can do to prevent disease and to help reverse. And we will be looking at GMOs and the Roundup herbicide that's sprayed on many of the non-organic crops. And we're going to see a not just a smoking gun, but more of a smoking shotgun of converging lines of evidence and multiple patterns that suggest that GMOs and Roundup are probably the most or one of the most serious health issues that's driving up disease rates. And we're going to see also the reversal of disease when people switch to organic. And we can talk about the rigged research by the biotech industry, the threats to scientists and the ability to stifle and suppress. We can talk about the Roundup trial. I was featured in one of the exhibits in the Roundup trial that was successful against Monsanto Bayer. We can talk about deep molecular biology. We can talk about the current state of affairs around the world with GMOs. Uh, and we can talk about the ongoing problems of how the US government and other governments are captured regulatory agencies by the biotech industry. I've spoken about all these things, witnessed them firsthand. But the bottom line in terms of practical advice is to choose food that is not genetically engineered and not sprayed with Roundup at the very least, and ideally organic, which also avoids other synthetic toxins. And the second main conclusion is that the problem now with GMOs being so cheap and easy goes way beyond our health. You can become a genetic engineer for $169 getting a do-it-yourself kit from Amazon. If you want to pay $2,000, you can build your own biohacker lab in your basement or your garage. And you could start producing organisms that have never been part of the evolution in nature and release them in the environment without any required government oversight. And your output could last beyond your children's 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 children. And the product of genetic engineering, the most common result is surprise side effects. There's massive collateral damage that occurs on the level of the cell, and most of that damage and most of the things that can go wrong are never evaluated by the genetic engineers that make the GMO. So if you realize that the GMO released into the environment can become a permanent part of the gene pool, and that the most common result of genetic engineering is surprise side effects, and that with the cheap and easy CRISPR technology, everything with DNA is being targeted, and we can foresee, if we don't stop it, thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of GMOs introduced in this generation. We're looking at the possibility of replacing nature with dangerous genetic time bombs which when they go off, when they express how they have embodied some mistake or unpredicted side effect, we could see catastrophes, even cataclysms, even collapses of ecosystems. So the existential threat today from the new GMOs is something that demands attention at the highest level. And it represents an inevitable time in human history where we can easily redirect the streams of evolution permanently. And that invites us all, it invites humanity as a whole into a different relationship with nature. Now that we can corrupt the gene pool of all living beings and all future generations, now that we can undermine the foundational underpinnings of ecosystems and pass that on to all future generations, it demands for us that we step up to become stewards of the genetic integrity of nature. And that is something that our Institute for Responsible Technology is taking very seriously. We were a pioneer in the first part of my conclusion about exposing the health dangers. We worked around the world. We've been working for decades. And I can report that our efforts have been successful, with about half of the world's population now concerned about the health dangers of GMO foods. But we have done a pivot, me personally and our institute, where our main focus is not on the health dangers, although I'm happy to jump into that completely here. I still talk about it regularly. But as far as creating new materials, new assets, and new coalitions, we're actually creating a new global movement designed to stop the release of genetically modified organisms, in particular microbes. Because although the ethics and morals create alarm when we think about genetically engineering humans, when we see the images of suffering genetically engineered animals, we also raise a fist. But very few people are concerned about the genetic engineering of microbes. But ironically, they actually carry more danger for health and the environment. They spread around the world. They can cause human health problems, ecosystem collapse. They can cross borders, be untraceable, and their speed of action is evidenced by microbes in general, whether genetically engineered or not. Take a look at COVID-19. So we are looking at a whole new global movement. And if you go to the website Protect Nature Now, you could see a 2-minute trailer on a short film that we're going to be releasing soon that will be basically starting this gathering, this momentum of establishing very tight regulations around the world and a deeper understanding in popular culture about the dangers so that everyone knows about it, and humanity as a whole is given the opportunity to step up and protect nature. So those are the two main conclusions that I wanted to draw up front, and I'm happy to dive in to either of the categories. And I think normally I'll give a presentation and talk about the dangers of GMOs and Roundup and the modes of action and the empirical evidence and the animal feeding studies and the epidemiological charts and the surveys of people. but I'm actually prefer to do it as a Q&A, and I'll just take a long time to answer to make sure I get in the points that I want to get in.
Well, let me start out by asking what significant pivots have happened in the last few years?
Well, one that was, well, I'll give you two or three that are very interesting. One is the fact that gene editing makes the whole process so cheap and easy. That unveiled the existential threat. I mean, right now, GMOs were introduced into the food supply in the 1990s, and yet we only have, less than a dozen GM food crops. But with gene editing, the speed of introduction can be very, very fast, and the oversight is non-existent in most cases, meaning that in the United States, you can introduce a gene edited crop into the food supply without any government regulatory agency looking at you. Before there was at least a facade, before there was at least a voluntary consultation process with the FDA, the USDA would look at it if it happens to have inserted genetic material from viruses or bacteria, but they'll say, no, if you've gene edited and you haven't introduced those, we don't need to look at it. The EPA is clueless about most GMOs as well. So that's one thing, is the new genetic technology that has been accompanied by a disinformation campaign that's been very successful. Because they derived CRISPR from natural mechanisms, they stretch the point, twist the point, and distort it, claiming that CRISPR is a natural technique doing what would happen naturally anyway, and that it's safe and predictable. Well, we and others have been compiling peer-reviewed published studies showing clearly that that's not the case. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong. We can go into that if someone wants to get a viewpoint of the science. But they have convinced many governments not to regulate. So that's one of the big issues. We have a new powerful technology full of unpredicted side effects, and we have even less oversight around the world. Another pivot point was Roundup. March 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer determined that glyphosate, the chief poison in Roundup, is a probable human carcinogen. That was a game changer. And it ushered in a big pushback against glyphosate. And as you can quite imagine, a pushback against the International Agency for Research on Cancer by Monsanto. And they mustered their support in Congress, trying to defund the World Health Organization, which was the umbrella organization over IARC. They fostered support among their lapdogs at the Environmental Protection Agency. They created a whole plan to try and orchestrate outcry. Those were their words. We have their documents. We have them all now made public because of a lawsuit, which is another pivotal piece. The lawsuit against Monsanto, which was purchased by Bayer, turned out to ring the alarm bell around the planet. The most damning evidence for dangers of Roundup is cancer, and the most damning cancer is, well, actually, there's probably, I would say, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease has even more evidence. But within the cancer, the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is the most supported. And that prompted some plaintiffs and their attorneys to sue Monsanto. And Monsanto was involved in the litigation when they were purchased by Bayer and convinced Bayer that it was a non-event. And so they held back about $260 million to handle all litigation costs and penalties. The first jury awarded Monsanto $295 million, surpassing the entire cache of money that they put together. Now, Bayer, who has suffered dramatically from buying Monsanto, has offered $10 to $12 billion in settlements for the 125,000 or more plaintiffs represented by attorneys around the country, and that's just in the United States. And some friends of mine who are the attorneys, one friend in particular, was able to make public the secret documents submitted to the courts, more than 1 million pages. And it was striking how completely obvious it was that Monsanto was controlling the EPA narrative, rigging their research, threatening scientists, ignoring evidence. I mean, the narrative is so stunning that it caused 3 juries, each of which got more of a download of more documents in each of the trials, to be so furious with Monsanto that the last trial, which was representing a couple, the jury awarded the couple about $52 million in compensatory damages, but the punitive damages was $2 billion. They were so angry because Monsanto's actions were so archetypally evil, from the way that you would watch it in a movie or read it in a comic book. It was ridiculous what a bad actor they were. Now, in every case of these 3 trials, the judges reduced the awards, and now Bayer has scrambled to try and stop the trial process through settlement. But that was a pivot point. The other pivot, we now have additional evidence on the health dangers of GMOs irrespective of Roundup. The Roundup evidence is greater than that of GMOs because there's a lot more research on the chemical than there is on the organisms. But the level of sophistication of the research has been quite sufficient to convince those that are aware of it to avoid GMOs and to try and create policies, if they can, to support that approach. We still don't have the upper hand in a lot of regulatory agencies. A lot of regulatory agencies are practically staffed by the biotech industry. And one of the ways that happens is people will leave regulatory positions and take jobs in the companies that they are formerly regulating. So they prove themselves to their future bosses by being compliant with the myths about GMOs. So that may answer your question. I'll think of more, but let's get the next one.
Well, I think that does totally answer that kind of question, but in terms of legal process, I mean, isn't it just the tip of the iceberg that maybe 0.5% of the potential plaintiffs have entered the court system, and that there's a tidal wave behind them?
Precisely. I was invited to speak at the shareholders meeting in Berlin or Bonn for this past year, where I was planning to lay that out. And when they switched it to a Zoom meeting, I knew that they would not really give me the chance to ask the question between 3 and 10 minutes that I was supposed to in the actual live meeting. So I created a video and a press release, and I was interviewed. I was at a press conference and a panel, and I made this point, Stephen, that I explained to Bayer that this is the tip of the iceberg, that there is sufficient evidence to implicate Roundup in many diseases. And we'll look in a few minutes at more than 30 charts of diseases in which epidemiological correlational evidence, which is not in itself conclusive, shows that the rise of the use of Roundup in the US food supply is rising in parallel with the increase of certain diseases, but we also have a lot more evidence than that. And I point out that there's sufficient evidence and developing evidence that links Roundup to other cancers, to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, to acute kidney failure, to autism, to diabetes, to digestive disorders, and on and on and on. And that if you look at the number of people who have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and you compare it to the number of people who have some of these other diseases, it's infinitesimal. And if you do a comparison of if you multiply the amount of people that have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma to achieve the number of people with these other serious diseases, and then you take their $10 billion settlement and you multiply it by the same factor, you get over $1 trillion. It's really a stunning. You quickly surpass the entire net worth of Bayer. So even if it's just a few diseases that result in further lawsuits, Bayer's continued existence is up for grabs. They're already saying that as one of their defenses from raising the amount that they're offering to the 125,000 plaintiffs, they're saying they're risking bankruptcy without going to any other diseases. So my suggestion to Bayer was that they immediately take Roundup off the market, which they didn't do. But I said, if you don't do that, then you need to do these things. Otherwise, future juries will find you aligning with Monsanto, the bad actor, because it's the, as you just saw, it was the jury awards for punitive damages that was so high. 2 billion in the case of the couple, the Piliads, 250 million out of the 295 million for the case of Lee Johnson. The bulk of it was punitive damages. And so I said to Bayer shareholders, they need to prove that they're not the bad actor, and there's two ways they can do it, assuming that they're not going to take Roundup off the market today. One, disclose every single piece of data that suggests problems with Roundup from Monsanto's documents and their current documents so that they become transparent. And two, pay for third-party evaluations that would look for links between Roundup and these diseases. And if they find some conclusive, they take it off the market completely. And if they find that it's not conclusive, now they have a scientific defense for future lawsuits. Well, that was my logic, Steve, and they didn't follow it. So they didn't release documents from that point. They didn't fund any independent studies. We certainly don't believe Monsanto's studies. And I'll give you one example. I wrote a book called Genetic Roulette, the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods. And 41 pages was just example after example of how the biotech industry rigs their research to avoid finding problems. So what I'm about to tell you does not surprise me because it's typical, but I never knew about it until the court documents were made available. And it is so typical Monsanto, it is laughable and bizarre. It's worth sharing. When you test for the absorption of herbicides into human skin, you can use cadavers. So you cut the skin, you put the Roundup on there, and you see how much gets absorbed. And then you report that to the EPA to see if it's going to be legal. And it turns out that the amount absorbed from Roundup was illegal, 10%, which was more than 3 times the allowable level. So Monsanto never reported the truth. Instead, they did a typical Monsanto study. They cut the skin of the cadaver and they baked it in an oven. Now, you know what happens with meat that you bake. It becomes tough and tough and harder and harder and harder. And that was a way to stop the absorption, but that wasn't good enough. They then took it out and froze it. And then they applied the Roundup to that frozen, baked human skin. And lo and behold, hardly any got absorbed. And that's the amount that they reported to the EPA. So it's entirely fabricated. I'll give you another example, which is one of my favorites in terms of false scientific assumptions. I love catching them red-handed. It was one of my pastimes for years. So there was a corn that was genetically engineered to produce extra lysine to feed to pigs. When you feed pigs, you give them the corn and you give them a lysine supplement. Well, this was going to be built in. And Monsanto's justification for saying that there doesn't need to be any tests on this form of lysine because it's naturally in the food supply, because it's found in soil. And soil residues are in our food. So therefore, no need to test it because it's just part of the human food supply and we're just now feeding it to animals. So Dr. Jack Heinemann, a molecular biologist from New Zealand called their bluff. And he calculated, or he recovered, the average amount of corn that an American male adult eats. Then he calculated if that adult were to eat Monsanto's high lysine corn for the day, how much of that protein he would consume. And then he calculated how much of that protein is produced in soil, and therefore how much soil that American male would have to consume per day for an equivalent amount.
Does it fit in a dump truck?
22,000 pounds of soil per second.
So it doesn't fit in a dump truck.
Per second. 22. They were off by trillions. So no, it's way more than a dump truck. Maybe a stadium. I haven't calculated that. I don't have the time. But this is an example of the Monsanto science, what I've called checkbook science. And it is so blatant. They'll hire someone like Dr. Parry, one of the world's experts at genotoxicity, because they were concerned that the studies on Roundup was causing genotoxicity were out there and that could link it to cancer. So they hired the world's expert to try and prove the opposite. He comes back to them and says, oh no, it appears that there is a link. And they send him all the papers and says, no, look at this. And he comes back and says, oh, this makes it even stronger. You can read the comments going back between the Monsanto executives that say, has he ever done research for industry before? In other words, doesn't he know he's not allowed to make that conclusion? And so they fire him. He gave them a report. They were legally required to turn that over to the EPA. They never did. Instead, they ghost wrote their own review paper, paying scientists to put their name on it, that came to the exact opposite conclusions. And that ghost written paper was used as the basis for EPA approval and approval around the world. So it was so blatant. It's ridiculous. So it's easy to discredit those in Monsanto and the FDA, where it was the FDA scientists that said GMOs were dangerous and could lead to toxins, allergens, new diseases, and nutritional problems. But their concerns were ignored by the person in charge of policy, Michael Taylor, the Deputy Commissioner of Policy, who was given that position after the White House told the FDA to promote GMOs. And so they created the position for Michael Taylor, who was Monsanto's outside attorney and later Monsanto's vice president. And then later the US food czar under Obama. So this gives you an idea of what we're up against. When you hear this, it is so obvious. It is so obvious that we can't believe the FDA, we can't believe Monsanto, and yet they've got billions of dollars, we've got $1.95. So we're up against a behemoth, and yet we still have achieved 51% of Americans believing GMOs are unsafe, even though there's actually funding in the US government to try and convince Americans that it's safe. So we've been able to get the truth out in spite of Monsanto and its enforcement wing in Washington. And 48% of the world believes that GMOs are unsafe. So we've been successful getting the word out. And thank you for having this forum.
Well, I'd like to ask you two questions about the legal context before we move on and talk about, let's say, microbes, for example. But one is, what are the chances that Bayer can, in a sense, handle the whole matter as a single class action lawsuit to limit their losses? And second, is there a movement to pass a law exempting Roundup claims from any kind of legal action?
There was an attempt to try to get the courts to void the outcomes because of the EPA approving it. In other words, Monsanto saying, we're not the bad guys. If it causes a problem, then the EPA is at fault. We were just going along with what's legal. And the court threw it out. So there was an attempt of a sort of a retroactive preemption. I have not heard of any preemption trying to protect them against future lawsuits. it is the type of thing that the biotech industry has done. Certainly the vaccine industry has done that. The biotech industry did that when there was attempts to get labeling of GMOs, and they preempted the ability of states or local jurisdictions to require labeling. That was in 2016.
Yeah, and cell phone companies are immune from any kind of adverse impact of their EMFs.
Yeah, so it seems like something that they may have been able to achieve possibly before these lawsuits and the global outcry against glyphosate. I don't think they'll be successful. And also there's a lot of evidence right now that they defrauded the public. So it would be hard for politicians to line up to support Monsanto in the face of that blatant fraud. Not impossible, but difficult. I haven't heard of anyone preempting future lawsuits from all categories. Even within the settlement, they have a certain amount set aside for future lawsuits. And so that's to be distributed based on people that claim that they've been hurt and haven't yet shown up. But that's just within the category of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that $10 to $12 billion settlement wasn't for all of them, because some of the lawyers were not accepting that settlement because it wasn't enough for their clients. I don't know the law well enough to say if it's theoretically possible. I just doubt that they can preempt all future settlements from a legal standpoint using the courts. It's more like a lawmaker standpoint, and that, as we discussed, may not be possible given how unpopular they have become around the world.
Well, to some extent, the cigarette companies had that same issue in dealing with the carcinogenicity, and they managed to lump it all together and shut it all down by I think some kind of class action legal proceeding.
Yep, that's true. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
I didn't put this together. Thank you.
Let's make a turn, and I got a kind of a deeply technical question to ask, where one of the things that I know about microbes is that they're incredibly promiscuous, and that they swap DNA easily and readily. And so is there much evidence that GMO traits that are engineered in and that get swapped by microbes either increase over time and are conserved in the microbial community, or are disadvantaged and selected against in that as they evolve?
I haven't looked at all the research yet in the microbes. It's interesting. It's on my to-do list, but actually what we want to do is to hire a molecular biologist or a microbiologist to summarize and evaluate just that question. It's very important. But I can tell you what I do know from research that's been done, and also some interesting theoretical case studies. I also can tell you that, even if there were studies that showed one or the other on a petri dish level, once it gets out into the environment and the ecosystem, things act differently. But what I'm going to tell you includes some pretty shocking, very shocking information. So we'll start with what's less shocking, is that the part of the genetic construct from Roundup Ready soybeans transferred into the DNA of bacteria living inside human guts. This was the only human feeding study ever conducted on the GMOs fed to humans. It was probably done in 1998 and eventually published in Nature Biotechnology in 2004, Netherwood et al. And it showed they had 7 human volunteers. They had colostomy bags, or elostomy bags. They had their lower intestines removed, not for the study. And they fed them genetically engineered soy burgers and a soy milkshake. And the idea was they were going to check to see if the genetic material survived digestion, because the biotech industry made it very clear that DNA does not survive digestion. And the researchers were very shocked to discover that, in fact, a significant amount did. It was recovered in the elastomia bags. But in three of the seven volunteers, there was actually part of the gene that had been inserted into the soybeans, making the soybeans survive sprays of Roundup Ready soybeans. Those had transferred along with the promoter, which typically turns on the gene, they transferred into the DNA of human gut bacteria. Now, we were not able to, or they were not able to, determine whether the transferred gene was continuing to produce its protein. If it did, it would create Roundup resistant gut bacteria. If you have Roundup resistant gut bacteria, there's a lot of Roundup in the food supply. So you're eating Roundup, that would provide a survival advantage to whatever bacteria in your gut have the Roundup Ready gene. So that's a way that it could distort the balance of our microbiome. Also, there's Bt toxin producing corn and soybeans. Imagine if the gene that produces this toxin were to transfer to gut bacteria and continue to function. It would mean that our own gut bacteria were producing an insecticide 24/7. Now, the Bt toxin is an insecticide because it is designed to poke holes in the guts of certain insects. In high concentrations in petri dishes, in laboratories, it pokes the same type of holes in human epithelial cells. So it's possible that we have hole-poking toxins produced inside our own intestinal flora, but that's not all. It also damages the microvilli. It also provokes an immune response, not only to itself, to the toxin in mice, for example, and also in farm workers who've used the natural form of this insecticide, but it renders mammals, in this case mice, more susceptible or more immunogenic to other formerly harmless proteins. So that means it could ultimately cause more allergic reactions and damage intestines and leaky gut. Now, in Canada, they tested the blood of 93% of pregnant women. They had some frozen blood, they checked it, and lo and behold, there was Bt toxin in there. And it was in 80% of their unborn fetuses. Now, how did it get into the blood? Well, how come there was so much in the blood? Because it should wash out. But it's not Mexico where they eat corn tortillas every day. Most of the genetically engineered corn that's eaten in Canada is already broken down, so there's no Bt toxin anymore. The corn oil, for example, the corn syrup. So the writers of this study speculated that it was the milk and meat that they were eating every day from animals that in turn ate the Bt corn and the Bt cotton meal, and that was the source of the Bt toxin so consistently that it was in 93% of the pregnant women tested. But another potential argument is that it was the Bt toxin produced inside their gut. But we don't know because the UK government was the funder of that study that came out in 2004. And as soon as they found out that the soy gene transferred into DNA of gut bacteria, they stopped funding these researchers in Newcastle. I spoke to one of them. They stopped funding it, so they never were able to get more information about the gene product, like we talked about, and they never checked Bt toxin. They just pulled the plug on the research because the government was pro-GMO. And this was evidence to the contrary. But if we look at other potential microbes that could do damage that might have a survival advantage, we can go back to 1991 in Oregon, where the scientists were trying to create bacteria that could help farmers in their composting and breaking down of crop material. Typically, the farmers would burn the crop residues after harvest. they created bacteria that would turn those crop residues into alcohol. And the plan was to distribute it to farmers all over North America, eventually all over the world, I imagine. They could mix their crop residues in big barrels. 2 weeks later, they would have open the spigot and they'd have alcohol. They could run their tractors. They could sell alcohol off farm as a profit center. And they could even take the nutrient-rich sludge at the bottom of the barrel and spread it on their fields. Now, the bacteria passed the EPA's approval process, and the scientists were going to be doing a release to see how far the bacteria spread on its own. A graduate student asked to do some research on the genetically engineered organism and was given permission and chose to do a research on the sludge. And he took the sludge and he mixed it with soil and then planted wheat seeds and compared to controls, and they were both growing. And he came into his lab one day on a Saturday and was shocked and thought he must have made a mistake because all of the wheat sprouts on the GMO bacterialized compost had all disintegrated into sludge. It was just slime. And what he discovered was that the compost contained live bacteria that turned cellulose into alcohol. And Elaine Ingham, the student's advisor, was later told by members of the EPA secretly, whistleblowers, that the EPA had done a secret, non-disclosed experiment where they genetically engineered bacteria and released it in Louisiana and set up monitoring around it and confirmed that it spread 11 miles in the first season, then 11 miles next time, then it keeps spreading. They stopped funding the research. Individual EPA employees or an employee continued to gather samples and eventually found that genetically engineered bacteria all over the planet. Now, here's what would be interesting. And they stopped the outdoor test once they found out that the soil was sterile because it was converting the roots into alcohol. But if you put the two together, what would have happened if they had released it and it spread around the world? The bacteria was called Klebsiella planticola. It's found on the roots of every terrestrial plant that has been tested. Food, forests, everywhere. Imagine if the genetically engineered version killed off its natural counterpart, which wouldn't survive in the presence of alcohol. The GMO would, the natural one wouldn't. Imagine if it displaced it because of that survival advantage. According to Elaine Ingham, the natural consequence would be to end terrestrial plant life. So there's a lot of ifs there, but we were 2 weeks away from finding out. In the 80s, there was a genetically engineered bacteria, Ice minus, that was designed to take bacteria that normally condense or gather water molecules and refrigerate them. So they wanted to stop frost on strawberries and potatoes. So they created this genetically engineered bacteria that took the Pseudomonas syringae and made it impotent, so it couldn't do its job. And they wanted to save the frost damage. Well, environmentalists and weed experts said, wait a minute, if you do that, it'll spread to weeds that are normally killed in the frost as well. So you'll have pigweed infestations that are year-round, and that could be a disaster. And so they had to sterilize the soil that they had done the release on. Now we know that that bacteria is used in the atmosphere to condense water moisture into rain and snow. And that this was in California where they were doing the experiment, that the winds come off the coast and it pushes into the trees and all that, creates an upward flow, some bacteria get brought up there. What would have happened if the Pseudomonas syringae, the impotent version, displaced the natural version, it could have theoretically altered weather patterns on the planet. So these are examples of things that could have gone wrong. And your point, Steve, about do we have evidence that genetically engineered microbes will outsurvive? I don't have that handy, but the biotech industry for years was saying that GMOs would have a disadvantage. And they were talking about that in terms of crops. And we know that's not true, because it was about a year ago where a study came out about genetic engineering in the wild, showing that many GMOs plants actually had a survival advantage. They had more seeds. They were more likely to proliferate. And in addition, the genetic characteristics would sometimes spontaneously change in future generations, which kind of blows your theory of doing any kind of risk assessment before release. So it was proven among plants, and that from a logical perspective, you have herbicide tolerant canola, which can't be killed with herbicides. That has spread. The canola seeds are tiny. The pollen blows in the wind. Now you have herbicide tolerant canola in the North Midwest. You have it in Japan, where they don't even grow it. It just blows off of the imported seeds that they crush for oil. So you have these herbicide tolerant weeds coming from Roundup Ready and Liberty Link canola, and that's become a pervasive weed. Or you have, so we can go on to examples of contamination, but there's hundreds of them. One report identified, I think, 396 documented evidences of contamination, but there's a lot more than that. There's thousands and thousands. I used to work as an executive at a GMO detection laboratory, and there's so much contamination out there that was originally disregarded as impossible by the industry. Probably want some good news, huh?
Okay, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, please do, or raise your hand.
Steve, will you call on them or should I?
Well, if I see an open mic, I'll call on them. Or if I see a hand raised, I'll call on them.
There's some questions in the chat probably.
Well,
you know what I can do? Art.
No, there aren't.
Okay.
You're captivating everybody.
Yeah, hi. I did put a question in the chat. I've
Art,
been involved.
go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I've been working in the agriculture industry indirectly, and it's apparent that in order to improve harvest, non-GMO crops are often sprayed a week or two before harvest, like wheat, say. There's not too many GMO wheats, but in fact, if you spray your wheat field, then the wheat just dries out. So when you harvest it, you got a lot of dry wheat. So before you sell it to the grain elevators, they check the moisture, and if the moisture is right, then you get a little premium, and if it's not right, you get a penalty. So there's a great incentive to use Roundup on non-GMO crops, and then that may be the reason Roundup shows up everywhere, like even in baby food on organic oatmeal. And how can we actually get some litigation or whatever in order to stop using Roundup on non-GMO crops to aid harvesting?
It's a great point, Art. And this is something that's important for everyone to understand. I used to say to people, eat non-GMO, and if you can, also eat organic, because then you can avoid all these nasty chemicals. Because we became aware that Roundup was being used as a desiccant to dry down so many crops that were non-GMO, we changed our recommendation to eat organic. And if you can't, at least eat non-GMO. But in addition, go to responsibletechnology.org and download our report, which has the results of all these different independent groups testing of foods to see how much Roundup residue there is. And you will see oats are among the highest ever, and beans and wheat. So they do beans and grains. They spray it. I live in California now, if you go to the vineyards, they have clean rows. They spray Roundup in the rows. It gets into the roots. It gets brought into the plant. It gets into the grapes. It gets into the wine. You spray it in orchards. It gets into the orange juice. It's found in beer.
What
It's all-
about sugar cane? In order to, you're not able, it's, if you go to Costco, you buy pure cane sugar. How much of that has Roundup residue in it?
You know, sugar is about 99 point, I forget, 4 or 5 or 6% pure. And I don't know of anyone that's tested sugar for Roundup residues. The problem is about 55%, I'm guessing between 55 and 60% of sugar in the United States comes from sugar beets. Now, sugar beets, 100% of them in the United States are genetically engineered to be Roundup ready. But by the time it gets into pure sugar, we don't know if there's any Roundup left on the sugar. However, the sugar beet pulp is put into the horse feed. And we think a lot of the horses in the United States are suffering from eating the Roundup that's on the sugar beet pulp, on the oats, on the soybeans, on the corn, on the alfalfa, because there's Roundup ready alfalfa. And we have talked to horse veterinarians and horse owners that have seen a market increase in the kind of diseases we would guess and predict would be in play if the horses were all of a sudden exposed to Roundup. So that's one issue. But I can't tell you about the sugar. And I haven't studied our own institute's list because it's extensive and we keep adding to it. There may be some information on there if someone wants to look at it and see if there's any sugar been tested. That would be good. They can answer that question and I will remember to look at it.
Okay, thank you very much for the comments. I'll take a look at that list.
Thank you, Art.
Thanks.
Muriel.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. So I'm supposing that organic food can't be sprayed with Roundup to dry it out and still be sold as organic legally.
Yes.
Okay. My second question is about the mRNA vaccines. Now,
Michelle, before we get into the mRNA vaccines, let me say two things. First of all, sometimes there's contamination in organic with Roundup, and sometimes there's contamination in organic with Gmos.
Yeah.
And part of it comes because of the amount of Roundup sprayed, it ends up in the rainwater. So in the Montana, for example, they may leave a field fallow for a year. They'll do what's called chem fallow, and they'll spray the entire field with Roundup. And then it'll end up in the air, and then the organic field nearby is going to end up with a small amount of Roundup. The amount of Roundup, as you'll see in the document that I mentioned to Art, for organic products is way less, but it's not always zero.
Mm-hmm.
Before you ask me about the vaccine, I'm not an expert at vaccines. People ask me all the time if I have a particular position on the mRNA vaccine, and I don't. If I take a position on something, it's because I go in and spend a lot of time studying it, and I ask people on both sides of the issue, and I look for data, and I don't do that with vaccines in general. Where I do come out on vaccines is that vaccines typically contain glyphosate, which is that chief poison of Roundup, because in the process of creating some of the materials that are used in the vaccine, there's glyphosate. And so I think that is horrendous, that they should allow glyphosate injected into the blood, given what we know about glyphosate. So I don't know, I'm not sure I'll be very helpful with your mRNA question. So you're welcome to pass on that unless you want.
Mariel, how about another question?
Well, going back to the organic crops. So as it happens, I've inherited some conventional corn soy land in Iowa. And because of its location, it's impossible from a practical perspective to transition it to organic. Because the heartland is so empty.
Well, there are better people than me to answer the question about what to do with cropland that has been sprayed with Roundup and where soy and corn have grown on it. But I'll give you the best answer I can. First of all, there's Roundup in the soil. It gets bound up, and the degradation of glyphosate can take a long time depending on the nature of the soil, depending on its pH, its organic compound content, etc., and the presence of certain specialized enzymes. It can typically take a year and a half for a half-life or a breaking down of 50%. The longest recorded half-life was over 22 years, but it's not expected to take that long. Some friends of mine are doing research on bioremediation, where they release certain microbes on the ground, and that eats up the glyphosate. I don't believe that's public yet, but I would, subscribe to the Institute for Responsible Technology, and as soon as we know, you'll know.
Yeah. So, are you familiar with Paul Stamets' work, Mr. Mycelia?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I've talked to him about glyphosate. I don't think he had any data on glyphosate eating microbes at the time I spoke with him, although I'm hoping that the next time I speak with him, because I'm sure a lot of people now have been asking him about it, he'll have some data. I haven't seen anything published, and it would probably come to me 11 times if it got out there.
Okay.
But there's also this, and that is, if you wanted to go organic and you wanted to figure out what you wanted to plant, if you wanted to go soy and corn, you have to make sure that there are organic ways of getting your product to market. And if you go to,
I'm deeply, I've been researching this for several years, and I go to conferences and all like that. So,
you may want to contact Ken Roseborough of the Organic and Non-GMO Report, because he has his finger on the pulse, and he has an organic and non-GMO source book, and he can introduce you possibly. He lives in Iowa and might be able to introduce you to specific users of those products that live nearby, so that the transportation costs aren't much. But there's also the possibility, and the Leopold Institute in Ames, Iowa might be able to help you, and others, of growing a different crop altogether and doing the 3-year transition and not having to be subject. If you plant corn and it's downwind of GMO corn, you might get contaminated even if you're downwind by 2 or 3 miles. But if your tasseling time is different, there's a way of protecting it. But in reality, if you want to be pure non-GMO, you can also get a type of seed called pyramase or others, where it doesn't readily be contaminated because it uses qualities of popcorn, which doesn't cross-pollinate. So those get technical, and Ken Roseborough can help you.
What was the name of his journal? Or
the Organic and Non-GMO Report, and you can subscribe to it as well. It's got a monthly or a bi-monthly newsletter, and it's got a report every year.
Thank you for that. Nichelle?
Thank you, Steve. Jeffrey, I have a question here, and this is totally very interesting. I have been off grain since 2014, so eating practically strictly a paleo diet. It's been very difficult to not have pasta, bread, or whatever, and that is good made with the grains. The question I have is about the European crops, the European wheat. Actually, I just bought a bag of European made wheat, And so far, I made the chicken gravy twice with it, and I haven't had any like health issues. The reason why I stopped is obviously all of this was making me sick. Within 3 weeks, every ailment that I had caused by the grains were gone. So what do you think about the European crops?
Well, first of all, they do use glyphosate as a desiccant in Europe as well. So eating organic European would be way better. Second, the European wheat has not been hybridized in the same way that the US wheat has. The US wheat has an increase in gluten, and also the way that they use yeast in US bakeries is different than in Europe. And so that there's greater opportunity for reaction to US wheat. Tom O'Brien, thedoctor.com, outstanding resource on gluten and wheat issues. I've interviewed people. There's FODMAP issues. There's the speeding up of the yeast so it doesn't break down the gluten enough. There's the hybridization of wheat, but you can't get away from the glyphosate unless you either know the source and you know that they don't use glyphosate, or it's organic. Many people have told me that they can eat the bread in Europe, but they can't eat it in the United States. So you're not alone in that. And the other piece that Tom taught me is that if you are gluten sensitive, only 1 in 8 people who are gluten sensitive show gastrointestinal problems. That the symptoms of gluten intolerance or sensitivity can come in many other ways. So that there's a test, the Zoomer test, for those that are into functional medicine, can show some antibodies and verify whether or not your immune system is responding to a variety of wheat or other things. And Tom also has information on his site about that.
Yes, and thank you for that. And also, but it seems that to me that I'm more like sensitive to the not to the gluten itself. And strangely enough, and it's funny because one of my French friend moved from San Diego to France, and now she can eat bread while she could not eat it in the United States.
Yeah.
For me, I can eat cheese in Canada, but not cheese in the United States. I'm not really sure what this is all about. But just so I understand, and I eat everything organic as much as possible. And so if I buy organic, then for sure it hasn't been sprayed with glyphosate. Is that the fact? Am I getting that right?
So the organic standards do not allow intentional use of glyphosate. Now, sometimes there's fraud and sometimes there's accidental contamination. Talking to my friend at Strauss Dairy in Marin County, he started testing his sources of feed for his cows and found, I think one was 6% GMO, which was very high. He was looking for GMO at the time, not Roundup, so he had to change it out. There were a study of 23 different products by the California CCOF organic certifiers, and they found 2 items were high or 100% GMO, and they're supposed to be organic, and those were animal feed. So there was probably some fraud or some mistaken identity in the transport. So it's not 100% guaranteed, but it is illegal to use glyphosate when you're intentionally creating an organic product. Now, there's a question: if you're eating animals that have eaten GMOs, is that a problem? Gerald Guest was the director of the Center for Veterinary Medicine of the FDA in 1991. And he and other FDA scientists were very concerned about the health dangers of GMOs. They were ignored by Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney. But he was quoted in documents that are on our website describing unique risks eating the milk and meat of animals that are fed GMOs. And we can surmise that one of the things he was talking about was the possibility of bioaccumulation. If the animal eats a mouthful of something that has a toxin, part of that toxin may accumulate in the fat of the animal or the bone or organ, And then the next mouthful will also accumulate. And then the toxicity in the animal's milk or meat can be higher than the grain. And we do know that there is some retention of glyphosate in the bodies of animals that have been tested, radio labeled, and it eventually makes its way to the bone. And but most of it is washed out because it's water soluble. I have two stories about people that are sensitive. One came from a farmer who spoke with a family who had their own chickens, and they were feeding them non-GMO feed, and they would have eggs every morning. And one morning, the mother and the daughter both had to be rushed to the hospital with anaphylactic shock. The father called the supplier of the feed and confirmed that he couldn't find any non-GMO feed and sent GMO feed, and that was just fed to the chickens before the reaction. And I have another person, that a colleague of mine, who was so sensitive that she will notice an effect in her body eating meat from animals that are fed GMOs almost immediately. And even when at one time she thought that the animal was fed non-GMO because that's what was told to her at the farmer's market, she started to have a reaction, and sure enough, double checked, and she had been given the wrong information. So people who are highly sensitive are like the canaries in the coal mine and can give us information that we wouldn't normally get from the general population.
Yes, I believe that. Actually, I'm one of those extreme sensitive person. When I moved to the United States from Canada in the mid 80s, I didn't know why I was feeling sick every time I would eat chicken. And I found out that at the time they were feeding antibiotics to the chicken. We did not have that in Canada. So I basically started to learn about, what was making me sick or not in the 80s. And, but thank you. It's kind of scary though. It's like, wow, what are we going to eat?
I know, organic and carefully.
Yeah,
you.
it's also the case that a lot of things in the United States, because of the institutional corruption, are worse here than they are elsewhere. So just have to understand that the United States may have a delusion of being better than everywhere else, but it isn't necessarily true.
And I would keep looking for the regenerative label, where they pay attention to the microbes in the soil, which will increase the minerals and the health of the soil, which will increase the health of the plant, and also sequester carbon, etc. Okay, I know some people have been waiting a long time, so
Lori is next, yes?
Hi there. You definitely addressed some of this. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you can. You're loud and
Okay,
clear.
great. Okay, so I live in Northern California in Auburn on 5 acres. We planted fruit and nut trees, about 30, and I happen to have 2 Arabians and do endurance. And it's so funny that you brought up horses because I feed them a grain Modesto feed that's organic. However, I have a difficult time finding non-GMO hay. Obviously, a lot of it comes from Central Valley, and depending on what year it is, if there's a drought, I have to get it from Oregon. But their manure is pretty amazing. We turn it over with our tractor, and then I use it for our trees. And now I'm like, I probably don't have an organic farm like I thought I was planning to do. And just wondering what I can do about this with the horse feed. And I do feed beet pulp because it's necessary for endurance in my world anyway, just because I like to soak it and it keeps them hydrated when you're doing a 50-mile race. And so I rinse it, but I sure wish I could say I'm rinsing out GMO too, but I doubt that, just the sugar.
yeah, the rinsing and washing of GMO crops, of Roundup Ready crops, is insufficient because it's a systemic chemical. The POA drives the chemical into, it's a surfactant, drives it into the crop, and it hangs out inside the crop. So washing is not sufficient. I know that the beets are all GMO in the United States. There may be some beets in Canada that are not. I don't think it's approved in Canada. I don't know. I haven't followed that in a while. I fought that battle some years ago, so I don't know what the current situation is, but it's possible to, if you need beet pulp, then you can pick it up from somewhere else, or if there's a substitution. I don't know. It's above my pay grade. The hay, are you talking about alfalfa?
see.
Is
I
it
can't.
alfalfa?
Oh, I thought I was muted. Yes, I just do a little bit of alfalfa just because it's high calcium and try to balance your calcium phosphorus ratio, but mainly orchard grass.
All right, so the orchard grass, I mean, those things, orchard grass is not GMO, alfalfa might be.
Mhm.
So if you're looking for non-GMO, the only grass that's GMO is alfalfa. But a lot of farmers don't use it because they won't want to feed pure alfalfa to the animals because they want to, it burns them. It's not great to have the concentration of alfalfa in most cases. So if you're mixing it with other grasses, you can't use the Roundup Ready method because if you spray Roundup, it'll kill the other grasses. And so you should be able to find growers of hay that includes alfalfa that's non-GMO. But the other hay wouldn't be GMO. It might be sprayed with Roundup, but you can find it, and it's possible. But before harvest, I don't even know if they spray hay before harvest, but you can find out. So as far as the manure goes, I know that for composting, you can, if compost is done right and it's heated to the temperature and it does its normal thing, it will destroy DNA. But you can still have glyphosate residues in compost. So for example, organic farmers and others can spread chicken manure and end up putting glyphosate on their crops that way. So you have to know, sort of find your, trace it backwards. And you can also, again, check with Ken Roseborough, see if he knows at the organic and non-GMO report, see if he knows of a few food chain around you that can source, and you can tell him I sent you. He's a friend.
Okay, next we have Mona.
I wanted to ask, thank you, if there's connection, if you feel there's connection between the wildfires and specifically the really crazy type of wildfires that fire departments have been saying are different from previous fires, and desiccation either intentionally or unintentionally with glyphosate.
I don't know. I don't know how much glyphosate is being used in the forest. I know that it is something that forestry places use, but the thing is, they would argue that it kills the underbrush and therefore reduces the fuel for the fires. So I don't know the answer to that. In a related question, I think it is increasing the flooding in Midwest. I lived in Iowa for many years, and Cedar Rapids had the 500-year flood. It was underwater. And no one put it together in the public's domain that the use of Roundup all around Iowa could have made that flood much worse than it would have been otherwise. Because Roundup is an antibiotic. So immediately those people that realize the dangers of antibiotics are a little gasping a little, because if you're eating antibiotics in every bite, you realize you're damaging the gut bacteria, which is even worse because glyphosate targets the beneficial gut bacteria, not the pathogenic. So you end up with an overgrowth of really inappropriate microorganisms in your gut. And in my interviews with Kiran Krishnan, an expert at gut microbes who did research on human gut microbiome and its impact from Roundup, found that the changes in the gut microbiome could promote a whole slew of diseases. In fact, perhaps after this question, I can show you some of those diseases that the gut microbiome changes can promote. It's kind of scary. But it kills the bacteria in the soil also that's beneficial. And part of the job of that bacteria is to create the structure of the soil for a spongy structure to absorb water. So if you look at a field of Roundup Ready corn next to natural corn after a rain, the natural corn has no puddles, but the Roundup Ready corn does, because the soil has become compactified. And since the rain doesn't go through the soil, it can be washed off. And so if you're taking the normal reservoir of water, Iowa, which has one of the highest uses of Roundup Ready crops anywhere in the world, if you eliminate its ability to absorb water, then it can drive that water into the rivers and streams, and then flood those and create very massive flooding. So I think it would have been good for some hydrologists to point the fact out, and we would have had another lawsuit with Monsanto. So there's one hand up. Steve, maybe we can
Yes.
answer that question, and then I can show some
Yeah.
of the slides I brought.
Darrell has his hand up and he's had it up for quite a while. So let's handle him and then you can run some slides, okay?
Okay.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to see if it's okay to are you saying to buy European, for example, pasta or wheat grown in Italy would be a much safer choice than but even if it's not organic in many ways?
No, Darrell, I think if you're going to buy wheat products, you want to buy organic either side of the ocean. You want to buy organic because they do spray Roundup as a desiccant in Europe. And even though Europeans don't eat a lot of GMO crops, studies show that European city dwellers still have glyphosate in their urine, which means it's coming from somewhere. And it could be coming from the desiccant use of Roundup. As far as
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
As far as whether to buy European or American organic wheat, I can tell you that, as I mentioned before, a lot of US-based wheat has been hybridized for increased gluten, and also the breads may be prepared differently with respect to allowing the yeast to break down certain components. But if we're talking about pasta, then then it might be semolina or durum. I don't know enough about the details of the type of wheat, and so I can't say that the European is necessarily healthier than the U.S. But I know that some people say that they can eat the wheat in Europe more easily than the wheat here. But in any case, eat organic.
Oh, okay. Thank you. And as you go into the next question about telling us about how we can help our microbiome, do you think using glycine as a supplement can really help with some of these effects that glyphosate is doing? Because it really will help support those pathways where that part of the glyphosate molecule is using up the glycine pathway. And there's a product called Ion. Can we take soil-based probiotics that possibly, so in other words, if we can't fight it, can we take things to help us like glycine and these soil-based probiotics?
It's a good question. So let's break that down. If you're eating Roundup and GMOs, then there's certain things that may be happening to your system. And I did a online summit with 18 experts called Healing from GMOs and Roundup. You can find that at livehealthybewell.com, where I interviewed Zach Bush and Karen Krishnan and Tom O'Brien and Dietrich Klinghardt and Lee Cowden and Joe Mercola and all these people about what would they do to treat someone to heal from GMOs and Roundup exposure in the past or continuing. And I never wanted and never planned to try and put it all together and eliminate some and add some others and make a standard protocol, because I'm not an expert at this. These guys are the experts, and they all each have different protocols, and they each have different products. So if you go to livehealthybewell.com, you can possibly take that course, or you can certainly sign up for that list. And as every time I find something, I share it with that list. So Ion Biome, which you mentioned, is something that Zach Bush and his team discovered/created. And he found that the glyphosate, it seems to break down 22% of glyphosate, but it also protects in two ways against Roundup. He put glyphosate in a petri dish with human cells, and immediately they separated, which is a form of intercellular leaky gut. he put the ion biome in there and it did not separate. And if he put it in there after the separation, it reattached. So the tight junctions were maintained in the laboratory study using his substance, which comes from 60 million year old soil. And I interview him for an hour here and there. I've interviewed him maybe 5 or 6 times about what it is in the ion biome that makes that happen. Then he also looked under a tight microscope and found that the actin, or the structural components of the cells, get destroyed by glyphosate, and that the mitochondria collapse and get destroyed. Mitochondrial destruction is linked to many different diseases, but in the presence of this ion biome, that doesn't happen. There's broccoli, which prevented the glyphosate. It's a different product that prevented the reduction of the NRF2 detox component from dropping in cells. It prevented the gap junctions from dropping by 50%. Then there's there's so many different things that I can bring up. I don't know about the glycine. I know Stephanie Seneff well. Her theory with others is that glyphosate substitutes for glycine and becomes built in as a misfolded and misstructured protein, which can explain a lot of diseases. That is not accepted among a lot of scientists, even many scientists that I know who are against GMOs and Roundup, like Michael Antonio, as Susan, you just mentioned. So she has a book. I don't know if it's out yet, but she has a whole description of the glycine thing, and I don't know if glycine supplementation will help. Let me jump to, as long as we're on this subject, may I share a screen, Steve? All right.
Yeah, click on that little green button and your screen will share.
Okay, I got it here. All right, so I would ask people at the end of lectures or at the beginning of lectures, what did you notice when you switched to non-GMO and largely organic food? And this whole list of 28 different conditions on the left was reported by people at about 150 lectures. So I sent out a survey to 3,256 people, and they also confirmed that these particular disorders improved when they switched to a non-GMO and largely organic diet. And both in the 150 lectures and in the survey of 3,200 people, digestive problems was the #1 reported improvement. And fatigue and brain fog, which I combined into one question, was always the second most popular recovery in the lectures that I gave. You can see obesity and anxiety and depression and food allergies and sensitivities. You can take a look down the list. Now, there's a few things I want to share about this list as you're reading it. First of all, I interviewed Kiran Krishnan, who had done a study looking at what happens to the human microbiome in the presence of Roundup. And he saw some changes, and I said, can your changes explain digestive problems? He explained the biochemical pathways that led him to say yes. Then I asked about fatigue and obesity and brain fog. Every single one of these conditions can be exacerbated or potentially caused simply by the microbiome changes from Roundup. But there's also other specific changes that we know about that can come from GMOs or Roundup that can explain these. And so we have pretty strong, plausible, causative pathways between the modes of action of GMOs and Roundup and these conditions. Now, this is 3,256 people reporting getting better from these things. It's not a very strong study. It's very interesting. But we also have repeating patterns where livestock and pets that were also taken off of GMOs or put on organic showed improvements of similar diseases. We have lab animals who were force-fed GMOs or exposed to Roundup who suffer from similar diseases or their precursors. And we have disease rates if in fact GMOs and Roundup are causing these problems, we would guess that the disease rates that would go up corresponding to the introduction and increased use of these things. This is the hospital discharge diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease, and that's the vertical yellow bars. The orange is the amount of glyphosate sprayed on soy and corn in the United States. And GMO soy was introduced in 1996, along with the corn, and it went up from there. And there's a correlation of 0.93. A correlation R value of 1 is perfect. This was 0.93, fairly significant. This does not prove anything. This is correlation. It does not prove causation. But in the context of understanding the plausible causative pathways, having the clinical experience, having experience in lab animals and in livestock and in pets, these correlations become highly significant as additional data points to add to our theory. And remember, the number one reported improvement was digestive disorders. So inflammatory bowel disease is one of them. I published that survey results in the International Journal of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine and went deeply into why GMOs could cause digestive disorders. Nothing was a guaranteed smoking gun, but again, we have a smoking shotgun where so much evidence has accumulated, it makes sense to make intelligent decisions to protect yourself. What I'm going to do now is simply go through 30 slides in about a minute and a half. I'm going to mention the disease. You get to look at the pattern below. In deaths due to intestinal infection, peritonitis, an inflammatory digestive disease, acute kidney failure, death. This shows both glyphosate levels and simply the percentage of GMO soy and corn.
Is that the blue line?
That's the blue line.
Okay.
Acute kidney injury, hepatitis C. That's against GMO soy only. This is autism. This did it a little differently. Stephanie Seneff, I think, ran this. She wanted to get a sense of how much total glyphosate burden was put on the autistic children. And so she included a total of the current year's glyphosate and the previous 3 years. And the correlation, R value, it should say 0.9972, is nearly a perfect one. And it's higher than if you just do the simple existing year. Diabetes, deaths from stroke, dementia, senile dementia, Alzheimer deaths, Parkinson deaths, obesity deaths, hypertension deaths, anemia, insomnia, sleep disorders, celiac. This compares the amount of glyphosate on wheat, so it's an outlier for this. Congenital birth defects, disorders of lipoprotein metabolism causing deaths, anxiety, suicide by overdose, schizophrenia, ADHD, bile duct cancer and liver cancer, kidney and renal pelvic cancer, urinary and bladder cancer, thyroid cancer, deaths from leukemia, and that's all we'll say for now. Now, if you look at all the cancer ones, which were the last ones, you simply have to read the reports about the trials for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and you understand why. There's the toxicity, the mutations that happen in the DNA. There's the animal feeding studies. There's the human and animal, there's the human population studies and exposure. There's plenty of evidence, and we know why Roundup may cause cancer. We also know that the communication between cells, which is called the gap junction, that drops by 50% in a petri dish study done by the people who sell broccoli, and they found that using broccoli protected against that drop. So we understand the mechanism, but other ones we have to dig a little deeper. So I'll tell you another mechanism and how we can figure out what that does. Monsanto bragged that glyphosate was safe for humans because they claimed that the only thing it did to plants was to shut down the shikimate pathway, causing plant death. And because human tissue does not have the shikimate pathway, it's non-toxic. Well, it turns out it's toxic for many reasons, and the shikimate pathway is still in play because the gut bacteria use the shikimate pathway to produce tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. These are the aromatic amino acids that are the building blocks of serotonin and dopamine. And serotonin converts to melatonin. So just assume for a moment that you have a deficiency in the building blocks of serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine. That could explain ADHD, sleep disorders like insomnia, anxiety, suicide, Parkinson's. All of those are related to those neurotransmitters. We could do things like that, pull apart a property. Zach Bush talked about the destruction of the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the energy centers of the body. The second most popular response of what happens to people when they switch to organic and non-GMO is increased energy and reduced brain fog. The mitochondria can possibly explain all of that. There may be many other causative pathways that can contribute to that recovery, but the mitochondria is significant. In my movie, Secret Ingredients, which highlights how several people, including autistic children, reverse diseases when they switch to organic food. My friend David Perlmutter talks about how the brain is 5% of the weight of the body, but uses 25% of the energy. And if the mitochondria are damaged, that could lead to things like brain fog. So if we can look at each of those diseases and trace them with lines to gut bacteria, mitochondrial problems, leaky gut, inflammation, damage to the digestive damage to the digestive tissues, immune system activation, things that we know that GMOs and Roundup create. Remember at the beginning, I said I'm going to give a conclusion. Now I'm going to remind you of that first conclusion. Eat organic. Even if organic is not 100% perfect at all times, it is so much better than eating with hands over your eyes. Just consider most foods in the supermarket FSOs, food-shaped objects, but not necessarily your food. So choose what you consider to be your food and don't listen to the biotech industry or their enforcement wing in Washington. You by now have enough information to discredit those people and to realize there's sufficient evidence to at least try being organic for an extended period of time. And if you do, here's my second recommendation. Create a daily diary and write down your energy level every day, along with the percentage of organic. And while you're at it, write down your mood, whether you have anxiety, depression, happiness. And while you're at it, write down every one of your symptoms. So you can do this online and just copy it over to see. So you have to write them all down if you have a lot of them, and rate them from 1 to 10 with the percentage of organic. Because some people may have seen this thing and go, oh, I have that condition, and they'll switch to organic to see if that condition gets better. But they may not pay attention to the fact that their eczema cleared up, or psoriasis, or some other issue that they weren't looking at. So that's why if you can do all of your symptoms and severity, and then even when you backslide and you go on vacation and you forget about what you're eating and you eat everything, continue with the diary. As you'll see, the doctors in the movie Secret Ingredients, when their patients backslide and go to their old eating habits and they see the old symptoms reappear, they are more committed at that point to an organic, healthy diet than ever before. So they consider it a positive. I'm going to pass it back to you, Steve.
Okay, let's go to Susie and then to Susan.
Yeah, I just have one question, Jeffrey, and you may or may not. I'm just curious about COVID and the vaccines and was COVID vaccine, or was the COVID microbe genetically modified, or if you know anything about that?
It's a good question, and I have interviewed a number of scientists on Facebook. If you go to the Facebook page at Institute for Responsible Technology, you'll see that I was actively pursuing that for a while. Haven't done it in a while. Here's what we know. The person who is in charge, who is the most vocal opponent to the possibility that the COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2, was genetically engineered. He was been given the chairmanship of the Lancet Commission to determine the origins. He's on another major commission, Peter Daszak. He is the head of the EcoHealth Alliance. His organization has received $100 million to do research on coronavirus and other things. He received $49 million of that from the DoD, Department of Defense, and was a partner and the major funder of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was, I think, 10 kilometers from the so-called center of the disease, which was supposedly the wet market. And he's the one that's trying to say it's not possible it was a release from WIV. So I discredit his position because of his conflict of interest. I also am aware that a friend of mine, Jonathan Latham, arranged the translation of a master's thesis which laid out how some miners in a bat cave got a coronavirus. Some of them died and some of them survived, but after having the disease for 6 months. And he pointed out that that could have been a way in which the coronavirus started to adopt to humans in their bodies, and samples were sent to the WIV. When the BBC and the Associated Press and others tried to go to the cave, I'm told in a BBC article of last week, they were blocked. Mysteriously, trucks ended up on the road, blocking the road, saying the truck broke down, so they had to go, or someone came up with data that was then confiscated. And there's been blocking of evidence collection. The article that appeared, I think it was Nature Medicine, that determined that there's no way that the COVID-19 virus came from genetic engineering, was based on a concept that, according to a computer design, if you wanted to optimize turning a coronavirus into a human virus, it would have done it differently. And because the computer program would have done it differently, for some reason they concluded that there's no way then that they genetically engineered it. But many scientists jumped on that as really a very, very flimsy and ridiculous argument. And in fact, they left out some key ways to increase gain of function that had showed, it had proven that their thesis was not true, that they could have easily genetically engineered or improved the virus to be human related. Now, all I've done was tell you data out there that you can find, but I haven't drawn any conclusions. If you look at the backbone of the virus, I've talked to virologists and microbiologists and genetic engineers. They'll talk about how it appears that it may be genetically engineered as opposed to a natural evolution of the known viruses that are supposed to be the precursors. There's not enough evolutionary time for those precursors to have done that, or their changes were in one part of the genome and not in the other, which is weird because that demonstrates a likelihood of genetic engineering. I really don't know the answer. I do know that the scientists who were even deciding to look at the question got censored. That very top scientists were not allowed to publish in peer-reviewed journals and instead had to publish in magazines or online. And that tells me that there's something going on.
There's a fix in the works.
Yeah, I've seen that pattern with GMOs where there's a narrative and the echo chamber that's manufactured will have certain talking points. And then they create a sense of controversy as if it's conspiracy theory to suggest it was a lab leak. And then there was the politicization because it was suggested by Trump. And so it became a political issue. So I would say I don't know the answer to the question, but I do not accept mainstream media conspiracy theory declarations. I think that there's a lot of evidence that needs to be looked at, and I'll leave it there.
Susan, do you have any other questions that you'd like to?
Yeah, there are some questions here. In my film, The Big Secret, which touched on genetically modified foods, was censored by Congressman Adam Schiff. One person asked, and I think the answer to this is yes, are the hazards of GMO and glyphosate additive, or are they more than the sum of the parts?
We don't know, but I would guess there's a synergy. And I'll give you some examples. Here's an obvious example. Detoxification is critical for maintaining health. And what's interesting about glyphosate is that it damages the cytochrome P450 pathway, which produces these enzymes that help the liver detox. And that means that the liver, which is detoxing many things, becomes less efficient. And so all the other toxins that were normally ushered out through the liver can become more toxic. The cells have a detoxification mechanism, NRF2. That is reduced in the presence of glyphosate. Again, reducing the ability to detox. So if you have, and then glyphosate also chelates with minerals. It was originally patented as a chelator, a descaler to clean the inside of boilers and pipes in industry because it grabs onto minerals. It grabs on the minerals in our body, makes them unavailable. Minerals are the key to the ignition of biochemical pathways. So without it, you have all these workers on strike. They're just sitting around waiting for the boss to show up. The mineral is needed there in order to get everything going. So now you have a non-functioning biochemical pathways. You have damage to the microvilli. You have leaky gut. You have lack of communication between the cells. You have all these things. And then you come in with a GMO. And whatever way that the GMO could cause changes in hormonal structures, in damage to we've seen damage to the immune system, damage to the reproductive system. We've seen early death. we've seen obesity, we've seen all these things just from the GMOs. All of the modes of action can become exacerbated because you've eliminated the foundation of health through all these different ways that the Roundup works, even the gut bacteria. Now, one study tried to see what was the difference between the two. They looked at Roundup Ready corn, and they fed the Roundup Ready corn to rats. And instead of the normal 90-day study that Monsanto uses, they did 2 years. And in the month after the 90 days, the rats started getting tumors. And by the end, there was a dramatic difference between the GMO eating rats and the controls. They had multiple massive tumors, sometimes the size of 25% of their body weight, at which point they had to be euthanized because it was considered immoral or unethical to continue to raise them at that point. So they had multiple massive tumors, they died earlier, and they had damaged organs. But Dr. Seralini also had another group that he fed just the Roundup in the drinking water to. And they also had multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So we think, aha, it's the Roundup that caused the problem. But he had another group that ate the Roundup Ready corn that had never been sprayed with Roundup. And they had multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So they both had similar symptoms independently and together. There's not enough data points to tell what type of synergy there was, but we do know that the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease showed up mostly with the glyphosate in the water supply, and that the amount of glyphosate was so small on a per body weight per day basis for these rats that the EPA allows on a per body weight per day consumption for humans 437,500 times more glyphosate than the amount that caused non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in rats. So it was parts per trillion and low parts per billion that caused this. And non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is not just an epidemic in the United States. Maybe more than 30% of Americans have it now. And if you look at the two, like the normal non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and the more serious one, they took a group that had both, they checked the urine, and the group that had the more serious one had more glyphosate in their urine. So that's an example of how we can see a small amount in the food supply may be creating a huge problem, which can be linked to cirrhosis and liver cancer and other things. And that, again, we don't know which is which in terms of GMOs or Roundup, so we avoid them both.
Another question we have here, well, we know that there's a problem of arsenic in our rice. And so they're asking about Roundup residue, especially with Lundberg basmati rice.
I've spoken to the people at Lundberg years ago, and I like them. They do organic. I don't know anything about the arsenic level there. But some people found arsenic in Roundup. I think that was Seralini's team. But I think a more serious issue was the possibility that arsenic and glyphosate worked together to kill the kidneys in farm workers in Sri Lanka and Central America. There is a disease there. It was originally called like a kidney disease of unknown origin, something like that. And there was a paper that came out with a hypothetical cause. And as it was explained to me by my friend Stephanie Seneff, that glyphosate binds with arsenic, and then it can smuggle it into the body. And then when it gets into the kidneys, it separates because of the chemical nature of the kidney. And now you have two poisons in the kidney, arsenic and glyphosate. And the paper, when it was published, got a lot of press, and there was an attempt to ban glyphosate in Sri Lanka because the death toll was enormous. I mean, the amount of people, it was mostly men, I think in their 20s and 30s. 25% of the workforce had kidney problems, and people were on dialysis. It was just 20. I mean, the death rate was simply enormous. I don't want to misquote it, but they tried to ban glyphosate. And there was a huge backlash, a huge disinformation campaign, and they tried to get the journal to retract the study. I don't even know if it was or not. We've seen that over and over again, but it still remains a possible plausible reason for this issue is the arsenic. So I can't answer the direct question, but it led me into another tangent there.
Another question is, somebody says sugarcane in the glyphosate data has 2,000 ppb. Not that we know what that means, but what does it mean in terms of a bag of cane sugar bought at Costco?
I don't think that so the question is it cane sugar sold as sugar, or is it sugar cane? Sugar cane with the cane will have a very high level of ppb, parts per billion. And that's because the sugarcane plantations are convinced that if you spray Roundup on the sugarcane just before harvest, you'll increase your profit. Now, a friend of mine, Dr. Huber, who is a professor emeritus from Purdue University, did some research, I think it was in Central America, where he proved the opposite, that using glyphosate actually reduced the profitability. So I'm just saying this just in case there's a sugar plantation owner among the people listening. They can find Don Huber's work and stop this dangerous habit. But nonetheless, Roundup is sprayed on sugarcane in many cases. We were talking to Art earlier, and he was going to check to see whether sugar in sugar crystals had any Roundup on it. I haven't checked lately, and I don't know the answer to that. But if it's sugar,
Yeah, I looked at the database. That was the only entry on sugar, and that was my post that Susan had just read, or whoever just read it.
So maybe we need to go in and find out the source of that and find out if it's cane sugar or sugar cane, because those are two different things.
Yes, I understand it. That's why I posted it, because there was some ambiguity.
Good. All right. I'll see if I can dig down, Art. Thank you. Susan, you are muted.
One other question. There are various tests to test the glyphosate in the urine, but one person wanted to know what tests. There are various functional medicine labs that will do that test. Does anyone on this call know the labs? Or go to a functional medicine practitioner, they'll know how to do it.
So we recommend on our website, HRI, Health Research Institute. They're a nonprofit in Iowa. I interviewed them and others, and I got a sense that they have a consistently very, very small limit of detection and a consistency. We offer a discount on our site at responsibletechnology.org. But they also do, and others do, a hair analysis. Now, what's interesting about a urine analysis is that someone at HRI tested their urine every day, and you could see it go down almost immediately. And there's another study that came out where switching to an organic diet dropped glyphosate by 70% in 3 days. We expect that. It's water soluble. If you're not bringing it in, a lot of it will be gone soon. So your urine tests may vary depending on your diet. And that's what happened with this HRI staff person who I happen to know. He went out to eat at a restaurant that I know and had a pasta dish.
And it spiked.
And it spiked. And then it came down. It spiked and then it came down. So the hair will deposit glyphosate more reliably over time. But I have not gone into the deep rabbit hole of trying to interpret hair or urine levels. I haven't done it. So it's out there.
Yeah, similar things happen with arsenic. that that the body can detox it fairly fast. And it's just when you have a constant load that you really end up with chronically high levels.
Mhm. Are we done with the questions then? You said one last question, and I'm wondering if we should wrap up. I can give a closing arguments in front of the jury.
Go for it.
Okay. This being members of a health-related organization, a health institute, we naturally spent some time on health. And I think we made a lot of progress in exposing ways in which GMOs and Roundup cause problems. And the good news there is that switching to a non-GMO and organic diet can reverse those so often. And it's not just a minor reversal. Those that 80% of the people that said, well, let me say it this way, 85.2% of everyone who was asked what got better when they switched to non-GMO and organic said their digestion improved. Of those people, 80% of them, it was either a significant improvement, nearly gone, or completely healed. It wasn't just minor changes. It was dramatic, huge changes. And I hear these all the time. Someone's 6.5-year-old is violent and out of control. They want to kick him out of school. She sees a film of mine, changes his diet. She said all the problems disappeared in a week. Within a month, she had a new son. These are the stories I get all the time. And they are dramatic. And if you only hear one of them, it sounds miraculous and unbelievable. But by the 2000th testimonial, it becomes predictable, consistent, expected, and part of an understanding of just how bad this stuff is. There really is the same takeaway that I started with. We did a deep dive, which could be very satisfying to our intellect, that we understand that we can't believe their research, we can't believe the FDA. There is evidence of all these different diseases. There's plausible causative pathways. There's epidemiological evidence. There's animal feeding studies. But it comes, and you can pass the link from this conversation onto your skeptical brother-in-law and your skeptical uncle or your kids or whatever. It's actually probably more effective to show them the movie Secret Ingredients at secretingredientsmovie.com, because you actually meet the people whose lives have changed when they switch to organic. And we also explain why. But this conversation does it as well. This conversation was quite fun and detailed. So I think it's important for me to link to the second conclusion before we go. And that is that in addition to the action step of protecting yourself, there's an opportunity to do more good for the world than any of our ancestors have ever had the opportunity to do. And that is because the technology has a threat that is greater than technology has had in the past. Possibly with the exception of a nuclear winter, GMOs have the capacity to collapse ecosystems, replace nature, corrupt the gene pool, and damage every living being for all future generations. In the beginning, we talked about one bacterium which could theoretically have ended terrestrial plant life, another which could theoretically have changed the weather patterns. We don't have to talk about COVID-19 as genetically engineered or not. It's taught us lessons about the nature of viruses. But we can talk about H5N1 and avian flu that hardly anyone had, because you need to be around birds or livestock, I forget which, for a long time. So they had a few hundred people, but its death rate was 24 times that of COVID-19. So what did genetic engineers do? They made it airborne. It didn't escape, but can you imagine if it had? And hundreds of microbes have escaped high security biolabs. We're in a time now, because of the pandemic, that what I just said in this past minute gets attention more than any other time in history. That we can genetically engineer a pandemic that's 24 times more deadly than COVID-19 with something already genetically engineered in a laboratory. And when that was announced, scientists said this is insanity. And it's still going on. We are now in a situation where the total population of the world is, in my opinion, ready to meet an unmet need to do something to protect against future calamities. So the launching of this global campaign to lock down GMO microbes, whether it's viruses or bacteria or algae, this is the time. And not only is it the time, but it is actually perfectly synchronous. At the time that we have discovered the true danger of microbes is the time that we have developed genetic engineering so cheaply that you can genetically engineer bacteria in your basement for $169. And your capability is going to go up and the price is going to go down. It's the time when we realize that this generation could replace nature and all future generations will inherit not the products of the billions of years of evolution, but the products of laboratory creations whose number one most common result is surprise side effects. So this new technology and this new threat is a new opportunity and perhaps a requirement for humanity to redefine its relationship with nature and with technology and with each other and with our governments, so that we realize it's our responsibility to protect all living beings and all future generations. And no other ancestors of us could have done that. No one could have done that. So we can look at it as a burden or we can look at it as an opportunity. Imagine being part of the generation that protected all living beings and all future generations, as opposed to the alternative. So I make this appeal. Please go to Protect Nature now and sign up to be part of our global movement. Watch the 2-minute and 21-second trailer. We are finishing up the 14-minute movie that it's going to be released soon. And we're going to be starting a whole campaign with a lot of material that I can't share now because I don't like to tell people in advance because it alerts the people I don't want to know yet. And if you can make a donation, and if you can make a regular donation so it comes to us monthly, you'll be joining our team in a very precious way, because we need to create a global movement. We can't build a movement from scratch. We need to appeal to the climate change movement, to the oceans movement, to the environmental movements, to the animal rights movements, to the health movements, to the functional medicine movements, to the bird watchers. We need to bring our educational assets around the world and embed the information that we have in popular culture. Yes, we want to lock it down through regulation around the world, but I know personally that regulatory policy can change like that. I was flown to Poland by the government and had a press conference with their environment minister praising their non-GMO position. A week later, a new government came in, pro-GMO. I got information to the ministries in Thailand when I was there about the dangers of contamination. They said no genetically engineered crops in their field trials. 10 days later, it was a new government, changed policy. So yes, we want the policy implemented, but we have to implement it in popular culture so that it's in the curriculum, so that every school child knows that this generation has a mandate to protect nature because we have a technology that could destroy it. And microbes is where we need to start because the danger there is greater. So I would like to invite you to participate in some way. If you have some free time, if you have some money you would like to invest in future as a donation, if If you'd like to eventually take some training that we're going to be offering, certainly sign up for the newsletter so you can become aware of what we're going to be developing and opportunities for you to reach out to your elected officials, your social media, etc. Because this is really, you can see why I've pivoted to this from the food issue. The food issue is significant. It may be one of the most significant things for our health, but this is existential. Our very existence as a planet depends on this. So we get to be the spokespeople for the non-people. We get to be the people who protect the biological evolution as we know it. And that's on our plate today. Thank you so much for allowing me to share and for answering questions. I see more questions coming up at the end. Someone asked about seeing the movie Secret Ingredients. Go to secretingredientsmovie.com. I don't have a chance to answer all the other questions if they come up now because I have more to do today that's due today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And this is probably the most timely presentation that we've done in a year.
And I was supposed to speak in August and I had to put that off, or
Yeah.
then again in October and I put that off. Some emergencies came up and I was going to be out of the country. And then, so yeah, timely is right. It worked out.
Thank you indeed.
All right.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.